As you can see, I got my 3 kids up front, so we'll see how this goes. I think, is my slideshow not working now? Oh, this would be right. Just so everyone knows, and I can prove a point. We tested it, so if anything doesn't work, Lloyd is the witness. He sat right behind me, and everything worked swiftly. So we're gonna see. It does work. It does work. Yes. Look at that. But Caleb, it's fine if she plays with the ball. It's not gonna mess up anything. Well, no, it won't, Edie.
Just ignore.
It's all right. We can ignore it. Some noise is okay. Okay, sorry, Gideon. Noise is not okay. We'll be quiet, and just for you. Now, but I thank you guys so much for being here. We're concluding our book on Judges. And I guess, if I'm honest, the ending of Judges has been really hard for me to prepare a message for. Partly because Judges ends in a horrific way. Like, the ending of the book of Judges is horrific. There's no way to sugarcoat it. There's no way to make it easier to swallow. But I think it's one of those things we have to read. Esther, throw it lower. But it's one of those books we have to read because sometimes the awful things that happen in our world, we have to see it. We can't just cover our eyes to it. We can't act like it doesn't exist. So there's other stories in the Bible. Judges is a book that's full of them, but you can find them everywhere in the Bible. These stories that we don't like to read. The stories that are hard to read, that are challenging. I want to encourage you to read them because I think we need to read stuff like this because these things can show us stuff. And I guess when I was thinking about the need to read this, I had something pop into my mind. I'm American, so I know. Esther, can you please stop throwing the ball? Thank you, Giddy. Look at that, parenting and preaching. I'm just jack of all trades today. But when trying to prepare it, I was struggling. I didn't want to really read it myself. And I started thinking about the civil rights movement, because I'm American. And there was a boy named Emmett Till. And Steve probably knows this story, being American as well. So Emmett Till, if you can see that bottom is Emmett Till. He was in Mississippi. He was a 14, 15-year-old boy. He got accused of whistling at a woman in a grocery store, a white woman. A group of individuals then decided to go to where he was staying, pull Emmett Till, this young boy, out of his house. They tortured him, and then they lynched him. And it's a horrific story. But one of the things that was amazing about this whole moment is his mom, you see there in the picture. And I won't show that picture anymore because I find it a bit disturbing. But his mom was so brave that she wanted people to see what happened. So she had an open casket at his funeral. She didn't pretty up her son. She wanted the world to see. She wanted America to see what was happening. She wanted America not to be able to run away from this horrific event. And if you look in the civil rights movement, this moment, and Steve knows it as well, it reignited it. The country came together after seeing this and said, we can't have this happen again. And it was a big contributor to some of the success of the civil rights movement. So I think if an amazing mom in 1955 can do something like that, we as Christians can read the books that are sometimes too hard to read. Because we sometimes need to see the horrific things. Because there's stuff for us to learn about. And one thing that's really interesting about the ending of Judges when we dive into it is a shift from focusing on leaders to focusing on the people. So you'll find chapter 17 to 21 kind of shifts for us. It moves away from focusing on these leaders and these leaders' character flaws, and it focuses on the people. It wants to show you something about the nation. It wants to let you know that the entire nation has been corrupt. It's not just a few bad eggs in leadership, it's the entire nation. So this is what the closing of the book kind of does. And it paints it in a really disturbing, horrific way. And I won't read all the passages out this morning, but I'll give you a little rundown of what we find in chapter 17, 18, and chapter 19 to 20. So chapter 17, you'll read of a guy named Micah's idolatry. He gets some false idols and that kind of stuff. Nothing too crazy yet. But then, chapter 18, you read about this Canaanite army. And it's a private army. They decide to go and steal Micah's idol. So they do that. Saw little people who are standing in their way. And then there's an entire town called Lavish. And they decide, to annihilate that town. Burn it to a crisp, everything in it. And it's kind of like, yeah, Judges, this is good. This is good reading, right? It's hard reading. And then you get to chapter 19 to 21, which is probably the most horrific and disturbing part of Judges. And that's about the concubine at Gibeah and a civil war that sparked from it. And this story is disturbing. I won't read it all out to you, but it is full of some horrific things. You read about a man going to get his concubine back. And then when he does, he's traveling back home, and he decides to stay in Gibeah. No one lets him in at first. Then an old guy's like, oh, you can come to my house. So he goes, he takes, his people traveling with him, his concubine, and they go there. The whole town surrounds this house because they want to sexually assault this man. The old man then offers up his daughters and the concubine. They end up taking the concubine. She gets brutalized the whole night. Rounds up dead at the doorstep. This bloke then goes home, dismembers his dead concubine, and then sends it to each of the tribes. And this sparks a civil war. Civil war breaks out. Civil wars are still messy. There's not really unity at the end of this civil war. You have the Benonite tribe who kind of steals some women because Israel doesn't want to give them any of their women because, that was the people who did this stuff to the concubine. And it's really messy. It's really disturbing. And it's interesting because this civil war ends with disunity and a devaluing of humanity. So I know this section of Judges will be hard to read. And I'm not going to read it out to you this morning. I want to encourage you to take some time with God and read it. Don't skim over it like we too often do. I know I'm accustomed to that. I love my Jesus stories. I'll just skip everything in the Bible and I'll go to when Jesus did this awesome stuff. But we can't do that. We have to read it. So I want to encourage you to sit and read it, even if it's tough. Even if it's challenging for you, read it and see what God wants to show you by reading. And one thing I want to focus on this morning is how this book ends. And the verse that it ends with. And this is the final verse of Judges. In Judges 21, verse 25. After you read of all this horrific stuff, it says this: in those days there were no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And what's interesting about this is that this verse is repeated numerous times in the final section. It's around 4 times. So hopefully I got that right. It might have been 5, but I'm pretty sure it's 4 times this verse is repeated. Because Judges' ending point points us towards the monarchy of Israel. That's what we're going to read up next. You get a little section of Ruth that's going to set up the Davidic kind of kingship, and then you get Samuel. And then we get all the stuff that leads to Israel having kings. It also points, though, to the Messianic king, where we allow God to be the judge. And I think our communion kind of touches on it, because Trevor talked about how it's belief in God. How can any of us ever judge what someone believes in their heart? That's not our place. That's God's place. It's God's place to be the judge. And I think one reason we're not meant to judge, to be the judge, is because of our tunnel vision. And if you don't know what tunnel vision means, I'll kind of describe it the best way I know how. Being a fighter, you fight in a cage, and people used to ask me, how can you hear your coach talking? Well, you'd have something called tunnel vision happen, where everyone else screaming, and there would even be people who would swear at you sometimes. I wouldn't hear any of it. The only thing I would hear would be my coach's voice, because I would have tunnel vision. And that's all I would hear on. That's all I'd pick up on. And I think sometimes if we're in the seat of judgment, we kind of have tunnel vision. As much as we want to act like we can be unbiased, that's not possible. We're a bit biased. We tend to naturally look out for ourselves. You know, I think of one moment in particular when Caleb was around 6 weeks old. Yeah, it would have been around 6 weeks. I was new to Australia. I was struggling. Me and my wife were only married a couple months. And I had the good idea of, Kim, it's so tough here, because, you know, it was tough first. So we need to go back home to America. I got a return flight. You know, let's call my family. And, you know, my family would have helped at the drop of a hat to get us back. I had it all mapped out. We go to Kim's house, and things didn't go my way. And I got really angry. Maybe there was some stuff done wrong by Kim's family, but I know, reflecting on that moment, I had tunnel vision. As much as I want to say I cared about Kim and Caleb, I did care about them, but what I was really focused on was Matt and his home. Matt didn't know what he was doing, and Matt wanted to be home. So everything I was making, all those judgment calls were coming from that place where Matt still wanted to get home. So I think we all have tunnel vision. And I think it's why we're not meant to be the judge, which is a good thing. And the book of Judges, I believe, shows us that. It shows us endless character flaws with the leaders of Israel, and it shows us endless character flaws with Israel as a nation. When we try to put ourselves in the seat of God. You even see as Israel gets a king, God makes a statement about how they haven't accepted him as a king. So you can see this kind of hinting. So I got a question for you. Are we willing to lay down our judgment and do what Jesus commands us to do in John chapter 13, verse 34 to 35? Now, Esther needs the band. Esther's got a good voice. She is going to be a very strong, assertive lady one day, and I can't wait to see what she does. But I think this is a big question to ask ourselves. Are we willing to lay down our judgment and do what Jesus commands us to do? Don't worry, I'm going to read John 13, 34 to 35 in a second. But I think we got to ask ourselves this, because how quick are we to make judgments? Now, let's say I came in this morning with a black eye. And no one knew that I was a fighter or did that sparring stuff sometimes. What quick judgment would some people make about a pastor with a black eye? Say someone comes in who's dressed not like us. What quick judgment are we making? We make these snap judgments all the time. Are we willing to lay them down? Because I believe the book of Judges shows us what happens if we don't. And what Jesus commanded us, if you don't remember that verse off the top of your head, is really simple but complex. This is what he commands us to. In John 13, 34 to 35, he says this to his disciples, I'm giving you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Now, this verse hits me hard. I don't know about you, but it hits me hard because it basically tells me Christianity is not about what we know, but how we love others, including those we would call our enemies. And that's challenging for me because I've spent a lot of money trying to learn theology and learn all this great stuff, which I'm sure is useful. But at the end of the day, it's all about how we love others. It's not about how many scriptures I can memorize. It's not about all these other things, which I'm not saying it's unhelpful to memorize scripture. So please understand me. But I'm saying if I knew all the scriptures in the world and I wasn't helping someone in need in front of me, I'm not really living what Christ has called me to live. And I think to really love like this, it means we have to lay down our judgment and meet people where they are at in life, with the love of Christ flowing in and through us. To me, that is what it means to be a Christian. It means to love others like Christ, which means holding space. I think there's many ways we could talk about loving others in the way Christ did, but I think one glaring example to me when we look at the ministry and life of Jesus was his ability to hold space. How often did he sit with the people who didn't deserve to have him sit there? How often did he sit and hear stories from people that were the bottom of society? He somehow had this ability throughout his whole ministry and life to hold space, because love holds space. So holding space, holding space looks like empathetic humility. I was pretty proud when I came up with that word. I was like, that's pretty good. Then I had to figure out what it means, and I'm like, crap. But to me, this is how I define it, which means truly caring for the person's well-being and recognizing we don't have or know all the answers. So if we truly care for the person's well-being in front of us, we're going to listen to their whole story. We're going to try to give them space to share what they're going through. And that's great to do, but we got to make sure we have humility with it. Because if I just hear a person's story and then I tell them the million ways to fix it, that I would fix it. Or do what Christians do sometimes when we pull out a favorite Bible verse. For me, it would be Romans 8, 38 to 39, for nothing separates you from God's love, neither powers of, here, there, all that stuff. That would be my go-to. But I think sometimes when we do that, it's us still trying to act like we know an answer. Thank you, Gideon. We're still trying to act like we got an answer. Now here you go, here's this verse. This is what it means to me. So this is what it's going to mean to you. But God's word's meant to be personal, right? Have you ever been in a study group and read a verse and everyone had the same thing shown to them? I mean, I've never had that in any Bible group. I've sat in lectures and I've heard people talk about, parts of the Bible and I'm just shocked. Like, where did you get that from? That is interesting. I love that. We all have this different view. So I think we're probably good at listening to people, but I think too often we want to believe that we have all the answers. Here's this Bible verse to answer this really complex, non-simple situation. And I think that hurts people. I don't think that's really loving others. And if I'm honest, our world's in a tricky situation. What I'm seeing again and again is so many of us wanting to be the judge. Wanting to tell people how to live their lives, how others how to live their lives, wanting to be the one in charge. I think as a church, the church needs to lay down its judgment. Simply just love like Christ. And I kind of think this is a pivotal moment for us as a church. And I know we're just, a small little church in Highfields. Who knows what God has planned in the future. But butterfly effect, we can start something. And who knows what the ripple effect is. But I think the church really needs to lay down its judgment and love like Christ. And I'm afraid for what happens if we don't. I think we see what happens when we don't do that. You see what happens in the book of Judges. Book of Judges is showing us that we don't have all the answers. It's showing us we need to allow God to be the king and allow God to be the judge. And any change starts with baby steps. So let's grow in loving like Christ by holding space with empathetic humility. Because that's challenging enough. And I think for lots of us, not me, I'm a bit young still. Even though I don't feel young, but I say 32 is old, and you guys usually look at me like I'm crazy, like I'm not even there yet. Because, our common age in church is probably what? Around 50?
I was going to say 100.
100, you think, oh my goodness, 100. No, I'll go 50. But you guys have something to offer. I mean, how many people like myself would you change their world if they came to you with a problem, be it marriage, life, finances, whatever, and you held space for them? You provided empathetic humility. What kind of impact would that have? And how challenging would that be? I mean, you guys have all lived it probably. You've probably went through it. But let's face it, times are different. Things change. It's not always the same. I try to remember that every time I sit with a young person, especially in my role as a school chaplain 1 day a week now. I mean, I sit with youth, and I think back when I was a youth, and I'm like, I got the answers for you. And I have to lay that down again and again. I have to just sit and listen to kids. I have to provide that empathetic humility. I have to act like I don't have the answers. I shouldn't say act because I don't have the answers. I just still think that I do. I really don't. And that's challenging to do. So I would love us as a church, if you get anything out of this Judges series, I'd love for us as a church to begin loving like Christ. By holding space with empathetic humility. I think if we did that, that's challenging enough. And man, what would that do to the people we talk to? The people we connect with? How great would it be to be a church that's known for loving people? Man, we might not have all the answers to tell you how to fix your life, but if you want a group of people that are going to love and support you through the struggles, go to that place. Let's keep growing in that, because what I love is we've had people come and visit, and I've had countless people stop me and say, you know how your church says a welcoming place? And I'm like, yeah, your church really means it. I go to some churches and they say stuff like that, but it's not really the case. But your church is different. Let's continue to grow in that. Let's spread that, because that's something God's already, I think, pushing us towards as a church. So I want to dive into it, and I hope you're willing to dive in with me. But I'm just going to close in prayer, and then the worship team's going to come back up. God, I thank you so much for who you are. I thank you for the book of Judges. I thank you for the ending of Judges that is hard to read. I thank you for what it shows us. I pray that you will help each one of us allow you to be the judge. I pray that you'll help us reflect on what Christ commanded us to do and realize that it's just loving others. Show us what that means, because love is a simple but complicated thing, so help us unpack that in our own personal journey with you. But help us start by holding space with empathetic humility. A space where we truly hear and care for people, and we recognize we don't know all the answers or even have all the answers. That's your job. We just hold space in love. Help us grow in that. Help us take that first baby step. I pray for anyone here who, needs that at this point in their life, that you'll provide people for them, that you'll be that person for them. I thank you so much for who you are. Thank you so much for how you hold space for me in times when I don't know what to do, God. And I know you do it for each one of us. In your amazing name, amen.